Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into one of the most bizarre military campaigns you've probably never heard of, the Great Emu War. Yes, you heard that right. A war against emus. But to understand how this odd clash between humans and birds even became a thing, we have to start with the broader context of post-World War I Australia. After the war, thousands of Australian soldiers returned home, not to parades and prosperity, but to marginal farmland, parcels of land allocated to them through government settlement schemes. Now, on paper, this was a noble effort to give veterans a new life. In reality, these plots were often remote, barren, and lacked the infrastructure needed to succeed. No irrigation, no proper roads, just hard soil and harder luck. Then came the Great Depression, which hit in the early 1930s and threw the global economy into chaos. Australia was no exception. Wheat prices collapsed, demand dried up, and those same ex-soldiers, already struggling to make a living on poor farmland, now found themselves buried under a mountain of debt. Many had invested everything they had, time, energy, and savings, only to watch it all slip away as the markets plummeted and crops failed. But wait, it gets worse. At the same time, Australia's native emu population experienced a massive surge. These birds, standing 6 feet tall and capable of running at highway speeds, began migrating in the tens of thousands, right through those struggling farmlands. Drawn to the water sources and leftover crops, emus trampled fences, devoured wheat, and flattened entire fields. For farmers already on the edge of ruin, this wasn't just a nuisance, it was a full-blown ecological crisis. So picture it: desperate veterans, economic collapse, and an invasion of birds the size of linebackers. That's where our strange and fascinating story begins. Let's zoom in on the problem that tipped this from frustration into full-scale crisis. At first glance, you might think this was just a bunch of oversized birds getting a little too comfortable in someone's wheat fields. But it wasn't random, it was systemic. You see, emus weren't just wandering aimlessly. These birds had migratory patterns and natural routes they'd followed for generations. And guess where many of those routes happened to cut through? Right across the very farmland that returning soldiers had just been resettled onto. The government, in its rush to reward veterans, never considered how environmental realities would collide with policy. There were no studies, no plans for ecological integration, just a top-down decree: here's your land, good luck. And the result? An ecological mismatch of epic proportions. These soldiers turned farmers suddenly found themselves not only battling poverty and drought, but also a new, feathered force of destruction. Emus weren't just eating crops, they were stampeding through fields, breaking fences, and inviting even more animals to the feast. It was like having a natural disaster on two legs. Now, imagine being in that situation. You fought in a war, you've returned home with hopes of peace and prosperity, and instead, you're defending your livelihood from flocks of birds, with no help in sight. It's not just frustrating, it's humiliating. So what do? You reach out, you write letters, you form coalitions, and eventually, desperate farmers began lobbying the Australian government, not for aid, not for food, but for military support. That's how serious this was. They weren't just asking for pest control, they were asking for soldiers with machine guns. This wasn't just an agricultural problem anymore. It had become a political crisis, a case study in how ignoring environmental systems can snowball into chaos. And the government? Well, they responded, but not quite how you might expect. Now here's where the story takes a turn from unfortunate to outright surreal. In response to the farmers' cries for help, the Australian government actually did it. They sent in the military. That's right, soldiers, uniforms, and all armed with Lewis machine guns, the same kind used in World War I. The goal? Suppress the emu uprising. Let that sink in. This wasn't pest control. This was a full-fledged military deployment against wildlife. It marked one of the rare times in history that a national army was mobilized not to face an enemy state, but a bird. Now, on paper, this sounded like a decisive show of force. But in practice, it was a logistical mess. The soldiers quickly found out that fighting emus was nothing like fighting humans. The birds didn't march in lines or gather conveniently in one place. They scattered, they darted, they moved in unpredictable, decentralized patterns that made coordinated attacks almost impossible. These weren't dumb animals. They were agile, fast, and highly evasive, and the inefficiencies piled up fast. In one operation alone, over 10,000 rounds of ammunition were fired, 10,000, and yet barely a few hundred emus were confirmed killed. Most of the bullets either missed entirely or ended up spraying into empty brush. There were even reports of machine guns jamming and soldiers mounting the weapons on trucks, only to be outpaced by the birds sprinting away. It was, by every military standard, a fiasco. What this exposed was something deeper than just bad aim. The tactics being used were designed for warfare, not wildlife management. And that's the real issue here. A centralized force, armed with rigid strategy and industrial firepower, had been dropped into a situation that required adaptability, local knowledge, and ecological nuance. The emus, without commanders, battle plans, or supply chains, were winning, not by force, but by flexibility. And this wasn't just embarrassing, it was a very expensive way to learn a very simple lesson. So, what was the outcome of this feathered fiasco? In short, the birds won. Despite the military's best efforts, the emu population kept thriving, and the crops kept dying. The few hundred birds that were actually taken down made no meaningful dent in a population that numbered in the tens of thousands. And remember, this wasn't just one flock. These birds moved in waves. You'd clear out one area, and another group would appear miles away by the next morning. From a cost-benefit perspective, the operation was a disaster. Tens of thousands of rounds of expensive military-grade ammunition, fuel, transport, soldiers' wages. All for what? A handful of emus? It would have been cheaper to hand out wheat to the farmers and call it a day. The press had a field day with this. Newspapers mocked the campaign mercilessly. Headlines dubbed it the Great Emu War, and they weren't being kind. Political cartoons showed soldiers being outsmarted by birds. Public confidence in the government's competence took a nosedive. It was humiliating on an international scale. And internally, the government pulled the plug. Operations were halted, the military withdrew, and with them went the illusion that force alone could solve a deeply complex, systems-level problem. But here's where things get interesting. After the military left, solutions did begin to emerge, but not from centralized planning. Local farmers, those same veterans who had begged for help, began experimenting with different tactics. Fencing, strategic planting, regional bounty systems. They worked together, they shared information, and slowly, they found ways to live with the emus rather than fight a war they could never win. It wasn't flashy, it didn't make the headlines, but it worked. And maybe that's the real lesson of this chapter, not just about birds or bullets, but about what happens when you trust systems over strategy and community over command. Alright, let's take a step back and ask the big question, what does the Emu War really teach us? Because let's be honest, this was never just about birds. This was about systems, specifically, what happens when centralized decision-making runs headfirst into local reality. Start with the farmers. They were veterans. Many had military discipline. They weren't lazy. They weren't clueless. They were doing everything they could to survive on land that was already set up to fail. The government gave them that land without fully understanding the environmental context. And when it all started to collapse, what was the response? Send in the army, with machine guns, against emus. That's not a solution. That's a symptom. It shows us a policy structure that reacts, not adapts. That throws force at problems instead of understanding them. A top-down system that believed in control, not cooperation. And look at the incentives. For the military, success was measured in confirmed kills. For the farmers, success was saving crops and protecting livelihoods. Those goals weren't aligned. The soldiers wanted to empty their magazines and report numbers. The farmers needed results, real ones. That misalignment between what looks like success on paper and what actually works on the ground is the silent failure in so many centralized campaigns. But when the military left and local communities started handling things themselves, things got better. Why? Because the incentives lined up. Farmers had skin in the game. They knew the land. They could test strategies, respond quickly, and share what worked. They didn't need orders from above. They needed autonomy. And that's the deeper takeaway. Centralized systems often move slowly, react rigidly, and measure the wrong things. But decentralized responses? They can be fast, adaptive, and tuned to local needs if you trust people to act. The Emu War wasn't just an odd historical moment. It was a warning. When you ignore incentives, when you impose solutions from a distance, you might find yourself outmaneuvered, not by a rival power, but by a bird. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this was weird, but it was just emus. This doesn't really apply to the modern world, right? Actually, it does, and more than you'd expect. Because when you zoom out, the Emu War starts to look a lot like a preview of bigger, messier conflicts we've seen in the decades since. Think about Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. In all of these cases, powerful centralized forces, militaries with advanced weapons, intelligence networks, and massive budgets entered environments they didn't fully understand. They brought heavy firepower, they brought plans, but they couldn't control the terrain, the people, or the unpredictable ways resistance would emerge. Sound familiar? Just like the emus, insurgents in these wars didn't play by conventional rules. They were fast, decentralized, blended into the environment. And just like the emus, they exposed a fatal flaw in centralized thinking, the assumption that power alone guarantees victory. It doesn't, and in fact, it often leads to what we saw in the Emu War: overspending, public backlash, low morale, and the slow realization that the whole system was built on faulty assumptions. Now, to be clear, human conflicts are vastly more complex than a rural bird problem, but the underlying lesson still echoes loud and clear. If you try to solve complex, adaptive problems with brute force and rigid systems, you will almost always lose to flexibility, to local knowledge, to the very chaos you're trying to stamp out. The Emu War is absurd, but it's also prophetic, because it shows us what happens when arrogance meets reality, when institutions confuse command with competence, and when empires, be they global or agricultural, learn too late that not everything can be conquered. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is humility. So what do we really take away from this strange, half-forgotten episode in Australian history? The Great Emu War wasn't just a logistical blunder or a historical punchline, it was a mirror reflecting the limits of control, the dangers of centralized overreach, and the quiet wisdom of letting systems evolve from the ground up. The truth is, no matter how much planning, power, or prestige a government holds, it can't always outthink nature. It can't always outmaneuver reality. And when it tries, especially through brute force, it often leaves behind chaos, cost, and a lot of uncomfortable questions. What the emus taught us is that real resilience doesn't come from command centers or top-down directives. It comes from adaptability, from listening, from local solutions shaped by people who live the consequences. In a world that still wrestles with centralized authority, with one-size-fits-all policies, and with institutions that try to engineer outcomes from afar, the Emu War stands as a quiet rebellion, a feathered reminder that life doesn't always yield to spreadsheets or firepower. Sometimes, the best way forward isn't to fight nature or complexity, but to work with it, to build systems that respond, not dictate. And that, perhaps, is the most important history lesson the emus left behind. Thanks for watching this episode of Truth Behind History. If you enjoyed this journey into the wild, the weird, and the revealing parts of our past, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget, you can also check out the podcast version of this episode in the link down in the description. And if you want more stories like this, stories that challenge the official version and ask deeper questions, stick around. We've got a lot more truth to uncover.